Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Demi Mohammed. I'm one of the public programs coordinators, and we thank you for being here today as part of our Centennial Festival. So we've been doing 2 straight weeks of Centennial programming. The museum turned 100 yesterday, so it was a lot of fun. We had it, yes. So as part of this celebration, we've had our artist in residence Sāgar here, and he has an installation upstairs in the pavilion if you haven't seen it yet. But we're having this discussion today with him and Adriel from the Asian Pacific American Center. And so we're going to talk about the process of the art, how we've gotten to this point, because it's been a long time coming. So we thank you all for joining us. Like I said, it's our centennial. This is day 10 of 14, so we have a lot of things happening this weekend. You can follow us on Instagram at natasianart, or our website it's asia.si.edu/centennial. We have a lot of things, and we are able to do this festival because of a gracious gift from Bank of America, so I always have to thank them. So again, I thank you for coming, and I'll pass it to these two to get started.
Hi everybody, how you all feeling today? Nice. We have like such a rich, concentrated group of people. I'm so excited. We have MICA students here. We have some of my colleagues from the Asian Pacific American Center here. We have friends from the National Trust here. It's just like this is where it's at today, right now. So I'm excited. I wanted to start this off with a quote from a scholar who I deeply respect, named Gabrielle Tayac. She's a member of Piscataway Nation. She says, "When we talk about history and we talk about memory, something that's so important to understand is, what is it that we choose to remember? What is it that we choose to forget? And how can we make that choice?" And I love starting off with that quote because it reminds me, whenever I'm doing anything at the Smithsonian, an institution that's celebrating centennials and just celebrated 175 years of existence, that here in DC, a place where there's constantly change, like these administrations, these elections, students coming in and out, these 4-year cycles, that we're really standing on grounds that has been cultivated and loved and been called home for millennia. And my mind can't even fathom 100 years or 175 years, and so it kind of explodes inside when I think about, the thousands and thousands of years that Piscataway people have called this place home, and that continue to call this place home. And so, as we sit here and we talk about history, we talk about what is ancient and what is historical and things like that, I like to remember the words of Gabrielle because it really situates us. Like when we say the word history, it's not just a term. Like it really holds everything. And I'm so excited to join and reflect on that idea with you here, Sāgar. So this is Sāgar Kāmath. Everybody please give Sāgar a warm welcome. I'd love to give you some space to introduce yourself, but I'll start off with my impressions of you and the time that we've talked together. So Sāgar first reached out to me in the midst of the pandemic, December 2021. A cold email, was looking to do a project, first-year student at MICA at the time, and just looked up Smithsonian curators that might be in the midst of what he's interested in doing, found my email address, cold emailed me and introduced himself. I responded back, and now he's showing work at the Smithsonian. So for those of you who are also practicing your own creative or intellectual work, just know that cold emails work. You should do them. And since then, we've had this wonderful working relationship, thinking through all the administrative bureaucracies of the Smithsonian, which can be, like a project in its own right, but also getting to delve into not just the concept for this, but also several backup concepts. And I really got to see the breadth of work that Sāgar incorporates into his work, and also, the different kinds of skill sets and mediums that you work with, and also the different ways that you think about ancestry and culture and history. And to think about the fact that you're just graduating on Monday. Like you're really at the beginning of your creative journey. It just really excites me, and I can't wait to see what you do in the future. But we're going to focus on that now for now. And so, Sāgar, please, tell everybody what you do and a little bit about this project that you presented today.
Thank you so much, Adriel, and thank you for responding to my email in December. I was Googling decolonization and different types of projects that were happening at the Smithsonian, and I saw the Futures exhibition with Christopher and Daniel, who were here, and I found out that you were the curator or worked on the project, so I contacted you, and so it's wonderful to make these connections. But I originally proposed to do a project investigating museums. I was just thinking about what it really means to be represented inside of a museum, and to, as you mentioned with history, talking about whose history gets told and how those stories are told. And so we went through a number of projects before we settled on this one, which this was the project that we kept returning to, but it was kind of the most difficult to execute in many ways because of the materiality. But so this is the outdoor sculpture, and there's 2 indoor sculptures as well in the Sāgar Pavilion. But it was the project that I think everyone kept being excited about, but it was daunting because of all the logistics that went into planning it. But when I got invited to do this project for the Centennial, I was thinking about what it means to celebrate time inside of a museum, so the museum turning 100, but it's also a concept that the museum is working actively against, and so the act of aging is immediately a no. So the act of conservation and preservation is what is held to the highest standard at museums, and so how do you kind of engage with time in a celebratory manner, and also in a way that you work with it as a partner or as a collaborator. And so I wanted to build something that decayed or browned and changed over this 2-week period. And all of the materials have different importances to me and different identities that I hold. And so combining them and building it here on site. And so each of those sculptures represents my body in a different way, in different contexts of the museum. And so it was such an exciting project to be able to just be here and labor over, and thank you to Jacob, who has also labored over that project. And so thinking about what it means to just be in the space and absorb whatever the context of the museum brings, and take that history of 100 years, but also of the land that is more and more ancient, and think about all of those histories colliding in one moment. Was exciting to me to think about the object, the space, and the other objects the museum has, all in dialogue in one situation.
Yeah, beautiful. And thinking about the different materials, we have some bamboo, we have some banana leaves, we have some hemp, and a topic that is very hotly discussed today, especially among institutions that hold so-called ancient objects, is provenance, right? There's so many institutions that they have objects that there's not even institutional memory of how they ended up there. And so I think that looking at contemporary art like this sculpture that is commenting on history and provenance, yet at the same time these materials, they have their own provenance that might seem benign today in sort of the context of where you got them, but I think it's important to know, especially for those of us who walk into a museum and see these works, and you just kind of assume that it was just kind of through some kind of magic that all these materials were sort of procured in very precious or very specific kinds of ways. But we really dug around for different ways to get them. Do you mind kind of letting people see behind the curtain and kind of where did you get the banana leaves? Where did you get the bamboo? How did you get the hemp?
Yeah, so the hemp, so the bases are made with a material called hempcrete, which is basically a mulched hemp and mixed with a lime binder and water. And I bought these molds. They were trash cans from Dollar Tree. And I packed them in there, and I bought all the materials from Philadelphia from a supplier there who imports them from France. The bamboo is an invasive material in the DMV, and I contacted Baltimore Forestry, and my friend Katie and I went and chopped them down and processed them all in the wood shop in Mica. And the banana leaves, I started my project with banana leaves, getting them from H Mart, which is a local Asian grocery store. And I couldn't get enough at H Mart for this project. And I kept calling H Marts and be like, so how many do you have today? And they were like, we have like 2 or 3 bags. And I was like, I need like 60 pounds. And they were like hung up the phone. And then I called around to Thai restaurants in DC and asked them where they buy their banana leaves. And there's a restaurant retailer known as V9, which supplies Asian restaurants around the area with bulk amounts of produce, including boxes of banana leaves that were frozen from Thailand. And so when you're talking about provenance, each of these objects have their own histories, and they come from all different parts of the world and are all in a diasporic setting in America right now. And especially, I think I was so drawn to the bamboo because it's a material that has immigrated from Asia and has cultivated this whole new identity here as an invasive material. And I just learned that there's some neighborhoods and areas around the DMV that are now outlawing the planting of bamboo because of how invasive it is. And so thinking about what that means as a metaphor for identity for Asian immigration into the US as well. So thinking about migration within each of the objects as a sort of provenance when I get my hands on them.
Yeah, I mean, and I kind of want to zoom in a little bit on what you were saying about the bamboo and the idea of invasiveness, because that's also something that I've been hearing more and more people talking about. Quick plug, in August, the Asian Pacific American Center, we're doing a literature festival, and one of the projects that we're doing is a weed walk. Not that kind of a weed walk, exactly. We're walking around DC and pointing out different plants growing out of the concrete and in the parks that have been identified as weeds, and the more you look into it, the more you recognize that the designation of what is a weed, what is not, what is invasive, what is not, depending on the time and the place in which you're sort of like naming that, there's a lot of colonial baggage in that, right? I mean, I think about dandelion and how that's considered such a weed, yet you go into a Whole Foods and you end up spending $6 in a bunch, right? Yeah. Can you talk a bit more about the bamboo? Because we also talked about the different ways that it's becoming used now in different industries, and how it really sits in this space that does draw a lot of metaphors with what it is to be an immigrant, or what it means to be a marginalized identity here in this country.
Yeah, bamboo has so many different identities around the world, and so in lots of parts of Asia, it's seen as this. There's a reverence towards the materiality. There's an abundance of the material, so they use it for scaffolding, for housing. The coffee bar upstairs, actually, there's a picture they have on their mantle that is where they roast the coffee beans and dry them, is in a bamboo hut, and so in Indonesia. And so the bamboo is such a resourceful material that you can really use for so many different things. And then it comes to America, and people are like, oh yes, this will be great for my yard because it'll grow really easily, and they plant it everywhere, and it kills everything, and you can't get rid of it. But you mentioned this to me too, bamboo also has this alternative identity from being rigid and stiff and used for construction, but then you're in California and you're trying to be trendy, and you get bamboo mattresses and bamboo sheets and bamboo straws, and so there's hundreds of different things that are being used from this material. And similar for hemp, it has such a complicated identity as well, as something that is hard to grow in the US, not because it's not able to grow here, but because of the legislation. And so all these identities make each of these materials so complicated, and have also multiplicities, like Asian diasporic settings, where you come here and a lot of people have to figure out how they assimilate, and they grow different identities, and that transition back to Asia is, whenever I return to India, I am a different person every time I go back, and India is also different every time I go back, and the part that I go, and the family members I go also change identities. And so thinking of identity less as this monolithic or this stagnant concept, it is something that is fluid. There are different layers to it. It's collaged on top of each other, and same thing for the bamboo. It goes through all these different phases and fits so many different needs.
Yeah. And you were talking about not just the bamboo, but also the banana leaves and the hemp, and how they're a reflection of your identity. So do you mind talking to us a bit about like the banana leaves, for example? Like, how do you identify with that?
Yeah, I just gave the story during my thesis lecture, but my parents live in Pittsburgh. I grew up in Pittsburgh, and we've lived there since I was 3. And so ever since we had a front yard, my parents have tried to plant a banana tree, but in Pittsburgh, so it obviously will not work out. But there was this, they tried to put it in a pot, they brought it inside, they brought it outside, it snowed, all these like back and forth. Every year they would buy a banana tree and then try to plant it. And then there was new varieties, there are hybrid varieties of banana trees that would become hardy for the winter, and we tried to do those, and none of those were successful. And so it became this constant, like every year they would go to Lowe's and be like, okay, we'll buy it again and try it again. And then when I turned 21, my mom, it was during the pandemic, or right before the pandemic, I turned 21, and my mom wanted to have a birthday dinner for me on a banana leaf. And so ever since that point, it felt as if the banana leaf that would be grown from the banana tree that they would plant would be a birthday present to me. And so it would just stay alive just enough until November. They would cut off leaves and then it would slowly die. And so this practice of planting these banana leaves became this really interesting experience where my parents would buy it and be 90% sure that it would die. But they would still cultivate that experience of wanting to have a banana leaf because that was so important to them for cooking, or just having, just looking at the tree made them happy because there was a sense of nostalgia, and I also fed into that. And so banana leaves have always just been a constant symbol in my life as just of food, of cooking, of home. Like going to India and eating off banana leaves all the time is like a very common practice, and this abundance of the material as well. People just have them everywhere. It's not like you go to the grocery store and buy banana leaves. That would be crazy. But
it's like buying dandelion or something.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to H Mart and spending $50 on banana leaves. My grandma would be like, what is going on? And the bamboo is from Baltimore, which I currently, until Monday, will be in school at the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, and thinking about materials that were connected with the places that I have been. So banana leaves have been this constant floating around my life, versus bamboo kind of really introduced itself to me as a material there. Even though it is invasive in Pittsburgh as well, I didn't really have a relationship with it there, but it became really present in Baltimore. And the hempcrete, I did my undergrad in civil engineering, and my first research paper was about hempcrete. And so it was, whenever I was doing this project and I had to figure out how to build the bases, I just had this moment where I was like, oh my God, it's now time. I'm going to test my research and see if it actually worked. And thankfully it did, because I built them like 2 weeks before I had to put this up, and I didn't really have time to build an alternative. So I was like, I hope they're waterproof. I hope they survive the rain. And thankfully it did. And another material that has adapted to so many different contexts and exists in so many different ways across the world.
Yeah. And I think what really strikes me about these 3 materials is just how versatile all of them are, and how storied their existence is, especially in Western civilization, right? Like, I think about, as you were talking, I was just thinking about the banana fruit, and like the original form of a banana is just so different from what you find at the grocery stores. Like, they have these huge seeds inside. They're not as sweet, and they were really just like genetically modified over and over and over again, until now you have like this like bright yellow, very sweet, non-seeded kind of a fruit. It was really sort of harnessed and kind of tamed by people in order to be made useful, right? And then you have hemp, which is like, some parts of the plant are like incredibly ubiquitous, used in so many different, many different purposes and things like that. And then you have a whole other part of the plant that's, outlawed by, most of the country. And so, yeah, I feel like each of these materials in their own way really kind of like speak to this kind of identity that you're talking about, right?
Yeah, and I also wanted to add the construction of this. I learned while I was a Boy Scout. I'm now an Eagle Scout. In Pittsburgh, and so all the lashings, I mean, we would be dropped off in the middle of nowhere, and they'd be like, okay, build your little hut, and we'll see you tomorrow. And can you imagine me doing that? But it was a skill that I never really thought that I would actually like kind of maintain, but looking at different pictures of bamboo from across the world and how they build the scaffolds, I was like, wow, this is something that I was taught as a basic skill, and it was interesting to like think of these elements that are basic in so many parts of the world that you can just like look past them or just like think of them as the mundane, but here you buy them organic, or like, you know, like your dandelion example. They are mundane to us, but when they enter a space, they become novelty, or they become something that is celebrated. And so thinking about how that transition happens, specifically in the museum context, you know, bringing this into a museum, which was difficult.
Yeah.
And what does it mean to like bring these materials inside, and that context that now shifts it as an art material, and what, just by being in proximity to these people and having me here talking about bamboo, now how do people now think of it as an art object?
Yeah. I mean, and getting the materials in your hands is, you know, its own set of stories, and then getting the materials onto Smithsonian grounds is also its own set of stories. And you know, a lot of times when I talk to artists and we're going through these challenges, and they're just like, but I just want to make the art. You know, like I really try to talk to them about the fact that like this is making the art. Like this is a big part of the process. You know, it doesn't all just land on your lap, right? Or it doesn't all just land into the museum all smoothly with open arms, right? Like you know, back in the day when I was a baby curator, and you know, like I met this other curator, Kitty Scott. I think I shared this story with you, Kitty Scott, and you know, like you know, every curator has a very different day to day, and so we always like to ask each other, so like, what do you do, right? And Kitty's answer was, I turn no's into yeses at my workplace, and I mean, you know, prior to being a curator, I very much like you, a very DIY artist, just like, you know, from the Bay, Oakland, very similar to Baltimore culture, like, or Pittsburgh as well. Like, I see it, I'm gonna make it happen, you know, like, even if it's like put together with duct tape, right? And then coming into the Smithsonian, where you can just get really weighed down by bureaucracy and institutions, people telling you no, just because it sounds like it should be a no. And so for Kitty to be like, you know, this is part of the job as a curator. You know, like when someone says no, you really, you know, investigate the weight of that no versus the urgency of what it is that you're trying to do, you know, and that really taught me to embrace these challenges. And so when you, I think it was like one of the earlier points of this project, you know, like you seemed a little bit down because like, I don't know if this, you know, banana leaves are gonna work, you know, like they're saying that we can't have decaying things in the museum, this and that. And then I was like, all right, let's do this, right? And so, yeah, like what would you say was the biggest challenge?
Adriel's being polite, I had like a meltdown. I think every piece of this had its own set of protocols that I think had to be discovered, figured out, coordinated, and I think just managing all those things. There is like a team of people, Nicole, Demi, Janice, that had to make this happen, not on top of Nafisa and you as well. And so thinking about what it really means to have this project, which seemingly is sticks and leaves, just be able to exist in this space, like every part of it had to be, you know, the bamboo had to be fireproofed and frozen for a certain period of time. And the banana leaves had to be inspected, and they were also bought frozen. Like there's so many like little details that what you said was exactly correct. Like it was about making the art. Every one of those details helped to make the piece because there was so much labor involved with every step. Like pounding the hempcrete into the molds and going to Dollar Tree, like all of that is a part of the story and a part of migration, because, you know, there is this romantic version of, somebody from Asia wanting to come to America and make a better life, and it's not a linear path. And so I think this story of transition of this sculpture from where it was in the forest or wherever it was in the world to kind of all meet each other materially and then be messed with by me and be able to be brought into this space is all part of its migration story. And it'll continue to evolve after the sculpture gets taken apart in its next life, and all of these things get imbued inside of it. And so I think all the difficulties that came with putting this project together, it makes it all that much more satisfying that it actually happened, and it becomes part of its legacy in terms of each of those bamboo pieces was handled so much before it was able to kind of be allowed to enter a space, which I think also is a metaphor for how much we have to go through to be able to be welcomed into a certain space and be celebrated in a certain space, and kind of conforming to that standard. And so even these materials had to be processed in a specific way to be able to be allowed to enter.
Yeah. I mean, while working on this project with you, it was a really nice, for me, it was a really nice reflection exercise, because you mentioned, my team at the Asian Pacific American Center, we curated a show in 2016 at the Arts and Industries building, and it was our first big project in a Smithsonian raw space like that. And the language that we used to present a lot of the artwork landed very crudely on administrators in a way where they're like, you are not going to do that to this building, and so when I was reading the languaging that you were doing, proposing the project and sort of like why some people were saying no. Remember, I was saying like, maybe don't say decay, say browning, like things like that. And it's like, you're saying the same thing, but you sort of like learn the language of the institution, right? And like you were saying, it's very similar to an immigration experience, like some people who don't have a sense of what it takes, they're like, oh, they're just gonna open the borders and people are just gonna flood in. And anybody who's been through, like even trying to get like a passport or their driver's license, you don't just breeze through the DMV, like there's so much waiting, there's so much, meticulous paperwork, there's so much anxiety, and a lot of times that's lost in the process when you just sort of like see somebody, like with their green card or, like with their citizenship, and it's like, oh, that must have just come easy, right? And I think it's the same thing. A lot of times you see this art in the museum, and for the artists, like maybe people think about, oh, like what are the different places that this artist showed before they got to this institution, or like what are all the different kinds of schooling or training that they had to do, right? But within each of those steps is like a billion other steps, right? And so like getting this sculpture, it wasn't just sort of like getting into mica, even though that was part of the process. Was like you got into mica, you got some of this education, things like that. You reached out to people at the Smithsonian, but then within all of that, you had to enroll in our vendor system, which is its own immigration system, things like that, right? And like nobody writes that onto the signage, like it's like this artist went through the 3 months it takes to get into SAM, but it's just like you should, because it's like it's its own hurdle, right? So I mean I really applaud you, especially as a young artist, because I mean there's been some folks who are just like they've seen some of these processes and then they're just like, you know what? Nah. What was it that made you that kept you going? Like even with all the difficulties.
I think I knew there was a light at the end of the tunnel, and I had to believe that, and I had to believe in my own project that it was worth the endeavor, even though I didn't know what the project was. When I originally contacted you, I had no idea what, it wasn't actually, I didn't even know about the Centennial, I didn't know about any of these things. I was just interested in having a conversation with you as a part of a research-based practice, or to just kind of like envision or see what the Smithsonian is interested in, and just to kind of keep tabs. And I think you helped kind of like be like, oh, there's this project on the horizon, kind of like keep you in the loop. I actually applied for to be an intern at APAC, and I didn't get it, but I had my portfolio laying around, so they were like, oh, yeah, this is perfect. We'll just kind of like loop this all in. Thank you to Andrea. And so it was a lot of like right place at the right time, and things just kept, there were a lot of lulls where I was like, I don't know what's going on, and Demi was on the end of a lot of my emails panicking, be like, are we still doing this? Hello, can we meet? But I think I just had to believe consistently that there would be something, and that if I found that in my experience so far, if I'm annoying enough, something will be given to me just to either satisfy me and just to be like, okay, leave me alone.
Yeah.
I cling on to people, and so like if you're like Dangle, you're like, oh yeah, there's a project. I'll be like, okay, I'm writing that down, and I will email him every week until he finally agrees to deal with it. And so that's a lot of what this project was just like continuously bothering people until they were like, okay, fine. And so and then all the pieces starting to fall together. But it's still a lot of it was figuring it out on the cusp of the night before. Like the banana leaves came in on the Thursday before. I didn't know where I was going to get them. So all these things had to be figured out very rapidly. But once people just started saying yes to things, like whenever I did 3 project proposals, this was my first one that I was the most excited for, and everyone kind of was all unanimous yeses on this project. And so that's what, but it was all hesitant to be like, yes, good luck getting the bamboo inside. And so that's exactly what this project was.
Hutama's out here thinking what we're all thinking.
It's Korean food. I don't remember what I was saying.
No. Well, I mean, we were like just talking about just like, you know, these institutions and just sort of like what it takes, you know. And I think it's like while you were talking, I was thinking about, you know, just sort of the butterfly effect timeline of how a project like this came to be. And one of the reasons why I really enjoy working with emerging artists or folks doing, you know, like some of their biggest projects for the first time is, you know, the frustration and then the joy of getting through that frustration really reminds me of, you know, like it really keeps me fresh. You know, like this month, it's crazy to think about, like, this month it marks my 10-year anniversary at the Smithsonian. It's like this job that, thank you. I thought I was just going to try it out for like a year or two. And before I got this job, I had not had a curator job. I had never worked at a museum. I cold applied for it. And at the time, I was living in Beijing, so I was like on VPN on the USA Jobs website, and I did that thing where I filled all the boxes, and then I clicked submit, and then it timed out, and then I was like, never mind, I'm not gonna get it anyway. This job, you know, requires a PhD. I don't even have that. Never mind, whatever, right? And then my partner at the time, she was like, just do it again. And then I did it again, and then I was here to be able to talk to you and get this project going, you know. And so hearing you go through that same frustration of it just being like, okay, well, I guess I could try my plan B, or, you know, like, I don't know if this is gonna work, you know. It always brings me back to that moment, you know, like, because, you know, like, all of us have these experiences of getting that rejection, right? But like you said, that what you put together for the internship that you didn't get ended up getting your work to the Smithsonian in a different way, right? And so it wasn't for naught, right? It wasn't like, oh, I tried that, it didn't work, well, let's just put that behind me, right? Like, it all accumulates, right? And I think, you know, I know we have like Micah students here, and this is something that, you know, like, I really think it's important to keep in mind, you know, like, just because somebody said no, it doesn't mean that, like, like what you have in mind shouldn't be happening, right? The reason why I was in Beijing in the first place was because my partner, who's now my wife, like she applied for a fellowship to study in Beijing, and then she got rejected. And then we were like, let's just live in Beijing for 6 months anyway, you know, like, and then she ended up getting her dream job afterwards, and part of the interview process, you know, at the end they were like, you know, like one of the things that really made you stand out was that you took the initiative to just go to Beijing on your own, right? And so it was just like, oh wow, like maybe she wouldn't have gotten this job she wanted if she actually got that fellowship, right? And so, you know, like it's so hard in that moment of like receiving that, like, you know, we're sorry it was such a competitive thing and you didn't get this, you know, like, but, you know, like keep that, you know, like frame that rejection, print it out and frame it, you know, like, because it's part of the story. It makes it so much sweeter when you actually get to do the thing that you had in mind, you know, and we get to see that now, right? Like you have work at the Smithsonian, and it's an amazing thing. There's nothing that can take away from how significant that is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think a lot of this project was frustration after frustration, so it was hard to see like the overall picture, and so like now seeing everybody here is a nice moment to like bask in like, oh, thank yous to all the people that made this happen. And yeah, I think that also speaks to a different level of the diasporic story, where spaces like this and a lot of other spaces and institutions aren't made to welcome us. They are made to exclude us, and they're trying to kind of like band-aid these situations where they're having diversity and inclusion and like this and that. But historically, these spaces were not meant to welcome us. And so how the amount of hurdles and amount of like, the amount of determination you need to be able to kind of like cross that threshold of like not being welcome to then being welcomed and having these situations is kind of what is intimidating. And I think being able to persevere and like have all these helping hands that kind of like help pull me into the space that I am in now was really, is something I'm very grateful for.
Yeah. I mean, I want to open this up to folks who I'm sure have questions to you, but I did, you know, like maybe as a last point, want to talk to you about that. Like, the Freer, it's celebrating its 100-year anniversary, and I'm always learning more and more about this particular museum. You know, like as an Asian American, I grew up, you know, I remember going to college and I chose Asian American Studies over East Asian Studies because I, you know, was looking at sort of like the faculty in the different departments, and I was like, I don't know what it's going to mean to try to learn my culture from people who don't reflect me, you know, like, and I felt the same way about ancient Asian art museums as well, and I feel like, you know, museums like this, there's always an ebb and flow. You know, like in the Bay, I grew up with the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, which also has a similar kind of ebb and flow. Yesterday, I was talking to Sojin Kim, who's a curator here at the Smithsonian, and she was talking about, at some point, there was a study, I think in the 70s or the 80s, at Freer, looking into how to engage the local Asian American community, you know. A few decades later, some of my friends at APAC are having meetings with folks at this museum, and there's a debate about whether or not there should be specific focus on Asian Americans. You know, like now, because of the time and place that we're in, there's, you know, more awareness of anti-Asian violence. There's, you know, like dialogue that was fueled by things like, you know, the first scene of Black Panther and stuff like that. Now it's back, you know, but I think Sojin mentioning that this was talked about in the 70s, and it's still being talked about now, helps me make sure to not take this for granted, because for all we know, 5, 10 years later, 20 years later, whole new staff at this museum, whole new social political landscape, we might land back in that same debate again about like, why do we need to talk specifically to Asian Americans about ancient Asian art? I wonder, why do you feel well, actually, let me backtrack a little bit. Like, what has been your relationship with so-called ancient Asian art, and how would you say that working on this project has shifted that?
Yeah, I think I started thinking about museums through the lens of ancient Asian art. I think growing up in America, you're kind of like, you're handed this culture of museums hold what you are, and so it was interesting to see growing up, like my culture would be represented with objects that were thousands of years old, but also so distant from me. they wouldn't be contemporary. And if there were contemporary, they were very small, selected contemporary stories of South Asian artists, which are now starting to be included. But the exposure I had was very limited. And so what I was able to connect with was these ancient Indian objects and South Asian objects that had stories that I have heard. But I think as I've been getting older and in grad school, I'm understanding that I don't necessarily relate to these objects as much as I used to. So I grew up also as a classically trained Indian dancer. And so in Kathak, we reference a lot of these same poses. And so a lot of it was thinking of the aesthetics of the objects and the aesthetics of the palettes. But realizing now that, like, thinking about the idea of what representation is and identity is, none of those objects talk specifically to me anymore. Like, they have a history, like we talked about with your initial quote, but that history was preserved by somebody. It's not necessarily the correct history. It was just a history that was chosen to be preserved and is continuing to be preserved. But what does it mean to have an object that really fully encompasses me and my identities in different ways? And I think those are all the questions that I'm interested in dialoguing with, and I don't think I have any answers, and I don't know if I'm interested in having an answer, because I think if I did, the answer would consistently change. But I think my relationship with these objects is much like my relationship with my identity, where I do have a relationship with them, but I equally have a relationship with the Philip Guston show that's at the National Gallery, and I equally have a relationship with other contemporary artworks that are happening right now. And I think thinking about what does it mean to be represented and what kind of story is being represented and how does that affect me was really important to me about thinking about this project. And I think questions about representation is not just about seeing where I come from. It's actually being heard. It's actually being represented in a more accurate way. And I think those can't happen until contemporary dialogues really are able to catch up and understand nuance in spaces, in institutions like this.
Yeah, yeah. And, like more and more we're seeing these, contemporary artists in dialogue with so-called ancient objects. I'm thinking about, for example, Rosanna Raymond, who's a Samoan artist based in Aotearoa, and a lot of the work that she does, or L. Frank Manriquez, who's a Tongva artist and scholar native to California, like they do work with the public, but a lot of what they do is actually going into archives and speaking directly to these objects, like recognizing that there's still life in them, and so when we think about what makes something ancient, what makes something historical, kind of going back to the quote with Gabby Tayak about what we choose to remember, like I think another word that I've been, really trying to incorporate more into my vocabulary is enduring, right? Like it's something that has been around for a very long time, but ancient, there's just sort of like this sort of past tense kind of tacked onto them, like sort of like their, like their moment has passed, right? And we all know that these objects, again, like even if they've been sitting in a museum for 100 years, they've been alive for thousands of years sometimes, like and this might not necessarily be the final resting place for them, right, or the final living place for them. And I think that what artists like you really do is inject life energy into objects, into institutions like this, so that people who come in and see these as like relics, they recognize that there's actually living, breathing relationships that exist, right?
And yeah, I think that speaks to the title of this piece, Life Cycle of a Myth, which thinks about how stories have lifespans. And so these objects have had stories that we're preserving, but how does that story kind of shift as it enters different spaces? And thinking about provenance, these objects, some of them have lived outside of their country more than they have lived inside the country that they were originated from, because they were looted or they were displaced, and then someone bought it at a garage sale, and then it got gifted somebody's grandson. Like, there's all these crazy stories of where these objects go through before they're turned into pieces of value. And so I think thinking about what history is being celebrated, it's important to remember that a lot of these objects went through people's hands and were assigned value by somebody. Someone was like, this is beautiful, I'm going to take it, I'm going to buy it, I'm going to preserve it, and those are chosen histories, and that's why they get to endure. But there's so many things in history that are just, pass. And so this object will just pass, and will only survive through documentation at the end of the Centennial period. And so thinking about what it means to have these stories be valued and kind of like enforced onto you as a child and be like, this is your heritage and this is your identity. But those are not the stories that kind of remain relevant to me as I grow up. And yeah, thinking about what it means for a project to be done with telling its story. And so this sculpture has done its job, and it's working until the 14th at night, when then it'll be done.
Yeah, and I think it's a hard message, I think, especially for museums, which are in the business of foreverness, right? To sort of be like, this will pass, right? So thank you so much for bringing it to the Smithsonian.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Everybody, please. Sāgar, kāmath. We have some time for some questions, and so, and I think I'll probably just pass the mic, because I know that we're documenting this, so you keep your mic, but if there's anybody who has anything they'd like to ask Sāgar, oh, of course, this museum has more than 2 mics. Yeah, also this is a great opportunity to just give a shout out to Demi and also Nicole and Nafisa and Andrea and Hutomo and Grace Murray, who's now at the National Gallery of Art. There are people at the Smithsonian. Like sometimes these institutions can really seem so distant, and I think especially for folks who call the DMV home, I've met so many artists who were born and raised in DC, and they're like, you're the first Smithsonian person I've ever talked to. And sometimes it really can feel like an ivory tower. Sometimes it really is an ivory tower, but there are really people here that care deeply about community and artists. And so any of you who are interested in engaging with the Smithsonian, whether it's as a volunteer or as an artist like Sāgar, I really encourage you to dig deep, there's somebody here for everybody, I guarantee you. So that said, anybody have any questions for Sāgar?
Hello, is this working? Yes. Hey, yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Yeah, it's kind of on. I know a little bit that you're going to be turning the objects into mulch, right? Something about that. And are you going to be putting them into the, is that mulch going to be then put into the grounds of the Asian Art Museum, like in the surrounding plants that surround this right now? Do you know?
So yeah, that was my original proposal, to think about this project as both ephemeral and enduring, your vocab word. And so to think about how this project is ephemeral, where it will last the 14 days, and then enduring, where it could be mulched and then put into the gardens or anything. But yeah, I think logistically we still have to figure that out. But
okay.
But yeah, the goal was to have it mulched and then planted around.
Yeah, because earlier I was going to ask, I was like, oh, is any part of the object or the material going to be tried by the Smithsonian to be kept or preserved? But then you answered that, so I was like, oh yeah, but then I remembered, oh yeah, there's something about breaking it down and making it go back into the ground.
Well, if anyone would like to purchase, I will keep it.
You keep the receipt, you can return to H Mart.
Yeah. I'll give you a picture.
Are there any either particular works or particular aspects of the museum that you looked at to kind of have your work be in dialogue with some of those aspects or works?
Yes and no. I think I've looked a lot at this museum and different works that they have. So I think subconsciously it has fed into what type of aesthetic that I was going for. But I think specifically the space that it was given, it's upstairs, and is in this in the pavilion, so you can see indoors and outdoors, and this structure is outdoors, but when you're inside, you can see all three of the sculptures together. And so on the other side of this object, you can see the window inside the Sackler, but on the other side is the Smithsonian Castle. And so I think there's something going on with this sculpture. I was using Christopher's language for a bit, but the sculpture is like imagining that it was the castle, and it's also in dialogue with the plants around it. And so it's like this fake tree that kind of blends in and camouflages, but it's not really a tree. And it speaks to all of the other planters that are in this space, and like the curation of what is going inside that pavilion. And so is it a floral piece? Is it like structure? So I think there's a lot of it that's in dialogue with the surrounding, but not necessarily pre-planned. It kind of just happened. And I think the line work of the bamboo is something that I've been working on through my own work as a painter, in dialogue with work of like Indian painting, which there's a fantastic show downstairs of Indian painting, which I think speaks a lot to the line work that is existent in the bamboo.
Yeah, and I actually want to say, I mean, one of the things that really draws me to this work, to your work, and also to this particular artist residency, because there's also other artists who are going to be responding to this institution's history, is particularly among Asian art museums, there have been a lot of exhibitions and programs where artists are, Asian American artists are asked to respond to works. Living in LA, I went to an exhibition at the Pacific Asia Museum, the USC's museum, at Tapapa in Wellington, Aotearoa. There, I saw something similar. I think one of the things that really draws me to this particular residency is that rather than artists responding to specific collection objects, this is asking the artist to respond to the institutional history, which, even working at the Smithsonian, I was like, wow, finally, this is gonna happen, because there was a time not too long ago where the Smithsonian was not willing to look critically at its own history. Not to mention letting outside artists come in and comment on that. And so, and I think that there's a level of depth that institutions disallow visitors to engage with when we don't get to talk about the institutions with a critical eye. Like when it's like, you can talk about these objects, but you can't talk about the cases, or you can't talk about how the objects got here, or you can't talk about the land this museum was built on. You can't talk about who was allowed into these museums at certain points in history and who wasn't allowed. And oftentimes, especially now with this, with generations of folks now, we walk into these museums and we don't just take objects at face value anymore. Like, we recognize that these walls were built by people. We recognize that these objects have very storied histories before they came into the museum. And part of that is, I think sometimes the education behind that is just as important, if not more important, than sort of like, the brushstrokes or the color choices or the contours of the object. All of that remains important, but recognizing the history, the institutional history of these objects, I think is added value in understanding these objects as opposed to a distraction. I think do we have time for one more question? One more question?
Well, I'll ask one. What's next for you?
Well, I graduate on Monday.
Yes, congratulations!
Thank you. And there's several of my peers also graduate on Monday, so yeah, I think I have to move out of my apartment by May 31st. And then I will be taking some downtime over the summer, and then my dad, who's also an artist, and I are doing a show in Pittsburgh in August.
Oh, that's so nice.
And then I will be looking for what's after that. So if anyone wants to hire me, let me know. But yeah, that's it.
Cool. All right, well, everybody, one more time, please give it up for Sāgar kāmath. And of course, also the team at the National Museum of Asian Art. Grace, hi Grace. Thank you, and everybody, thank you so much for coming through. Really appreciate you. And if you haven't had a chance yet, it's just right upstairs, this installation. A couple of the sculptures are inside, and then also right outside, you can see them. So.
And there is food on the plaza, like we all heard. Yeah, every day from until now, until the 14th, from 2 to 5, I will have bamboo leaves out so we can all doodle on them and then hang them on the fourth sculpture that's next to the other sculptures. So if you're feeling like you want to draw on some leaves, let me know.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Have a good
you.
rest of your day.